of the Council and the Oregon Ocean Science Trust, I welcome you to this morning of learning more about cutting-edge work on ocean acidification and hypoxia in Oregon waters by Oregon researchers, and a couple of pull-alongs from outside of the state as well. I want to acknowledge my co-chair, Lori Juranic from OSU. You'll hear from her in a minute. I also want to acknowledge Jenny Kester, who has gotten you all in this room today and put together this symposium. I want to acknowledge the front row here of folks who are going to be speaking on behalf of legislative investment in understanding ocean acidification and hypoxia. And I also want to acknowledge members of the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council, one of whom is walking up the stairs. Raise your hands, please, if you're on the council. And also of the council's Education and Outreach Working Group, Carrie and Fran and others, yes, in the room. So there are a bunch of folks who are here who have helped make today possible. So my job is to kick us off and say why we're having this symposium. It's a really interesting topic, but it's not just because of that. It is because Oregon has been really impacted by ocean acidification and hypoxia as kind of a frontline location where these symptoms of climate and ocean change have really hit home. And that work of understanding that started early in the 2000s with identification of hypoxia events, which also led to the oyster industry discovering, and I'm saying industry and OSU and others discovering the impact of ocean acidification on that industry, and that progressing over time, over the last decade and a half, to us really understanding the extent of this problem and how it's connecting to lots of species that we care about, including Dungeness crab, salmon, oysters, eelgrass, all of these kind of ecosystem and harvest fisheries species have these very profound connections and vulnerabilities to this problem. So we are in this room with the idea that we want to understand it and we want to find solutions to this problem generally. And so I thank you for being part of the solution and figuring out how we can make good choices moving forward. So the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council was created in 2017, and we have an action plan, and that action plan goes through 2025. This symposium is in it, and it was supposed to happen in 2020, along with a whole bunch of other things that didn't happen in 2020. And so we are here now to pick up after a couple of years of pandemic. Sorry, I had to say the P word, and move forward in a positive direction. But that doesn't mean that we haven't been active in the last 3-4 years. And so we're going to hear about some of the things where we have been active. I also want to say that later today, we're expecting one of the sponsors of this Council of the Ocean Science Trust, Representative Gomberg, to come and join us. I hope that happens. The legislature is in the middle of Ways and Means town halls this week, and so hopefully we'll get to hear from him directly in a little bit. So with no further ado, I think I want to give Lori a chance to say hello, and she is going to be facilitating our first session. So Lori, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for showing up today. It's really exciting to have everybody in the room and to get to hear about some of the work that's being facilitated as part of the House Bill 3114. So the first set of talks that we have, this first section this morning, is along the theme of advancing scientific understanding. And just to give the speakers a little bit of a heads up, we do have kind of a tight schedule, so I'm going to be standing up when you have about a minute or two left in your talk, and then I'll be encroaching on the podium as you should be wrapping up. So if you can do your best to kind of keep on time. So with that, I'm going to invite Francis up for the first talk. I'm going to give a little bio for each speaker. Francis Chan is an associate professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at Oregon State University. He is also the director of the joint NOAA-OSU Cooperative Institute for Marine Ecosystem and Resources Research, CIMRS. Chan holds a PhD in ecology from Cornell University. Chan's areas of research are in ecosystem ecology and biogeochemistry. He has worked extensively in Oregon's coastal ocean with 2 decades of experience in the study of low oxygen zones and their ecological impacts. All right, take it away.
Thank you, Lori. Let's see. Okay. Thank you. Well, it's really an honor to share with you some of the science that I've been a part of and to represent some of the science community that's been engaged in this work. So what I want to share is collaborative and leverage OAH monitoring. And it's really the question that I'm posing for myself is, can more data really ready us for the changes ahead? And you should always be suspectful of scientists because we always say we want more data, but I want to share maybe there is some value to getting more data. And you know, we see headlines like this because like as Karin said, we're really on the front line of these climate mediated global change, right? And actually, I think that's Burke Hales on the back of the Oceanus deploying one of his moorings. And the question that I want to ask is, what should we really be doing to ready our state for these changes that we know are coming? And luckily, we actually have a roadmap in Oregon. This is the OAH Council's OAH Action Plan, and laser. So right in number 1, advanced scientific understanding to address OAH vulnerabilities. So we want to know something about how the system's changing. And you know, for me, it's like, well, will we know it if our oceans ran out of oxygen? So this was a couple years ago. This was the Holiday Farm fire around Labor Day. Actually, a couple of days later, we're at sea. Now, when we have a wildfire, you know it. There's no question. This was a couple of days at sea where we're recovering some of our moorings. You know, it was smoky, oddly freaky smoky, but you know, we couldn't tell from the surface of the ocean whether we had enough oxygen. I mean, that's just no way that we can tell remotely. But luckily, we have a mooring that's supported, that's currently supported by some state funds, of course. And we saw that we actually were out there right here. We picked up the mooring on this day, and even though we had been there, this sensor had been tracking the progression of hypoxia. So in this year, end of June till end of August, you know, a couple months. That's a pretty long time for some, you know, fish to hold its breath. So that's how hypoxia lasted that season. But there's value in being able to sustain time series observations, not just because we're unimaginative and we want to do the same thing year after year, because we want to tell how systems might be changing from year to year. And here, this is the next year where we had a very early start of the upwelling season. And what we saw at this site, this is off Cape Perpetua, that we started seeing hypoxic water right in April, actually. It came back up a little bit. But up until we pulled the mooring in October, that body of water is hypoxic. In fact, we were getting zeros down in this time period. So it's really hard for an animal to hold its breath for that long, especially when there's no oxygen. And the system is really dynamic. It just changes from year to year. Last year, we had a very late start upwelling season, which I was like, great, because usually, you kind of, it's almost like an almanac understanding where, well, when the upwelling season starts late, we tend not to get the currents that pull in as much low oxygen water. We don't have as productive an ocean that feeds that low oxygen zone when things fall into it. And we should expect a lack of hypoxia. But in fact, we started seeing it, and it actually got really low, quite close to zero by the end of July, which was just surprising to me. Now, I told you science observations is one spot in the ocean. So this is at 70 meters, 44.25 north. But I love this picture of the Oregon coast. I mean, there's a lot of geography, a lot of neighborhoods. You know, would my measurement from right there tell us enough about what else is happening other places? And oh, by the way, we visit that mooring every 1 to 2 months. So at times, when I publish the mooring, oh, by the way, here's the late breaking news, 2 months ago was hypoxic. Would that do anyone any good? And surely we must have a lot of observations. John Fram from the OI is here. Kind of and kind of not, because we did an inventory of where are we measuring as a scientific community with moorings dissolve oxygen. And this is the map that we came up with. And the red stars are places that report in real time. Other ones are dependent on us going to the mooring, pulling it up, and downloading data. And we actually have relatively poor coverage in Oregon. And to be honest, geography is really expensive, right? We use the LACA a lot. That's $4K a day. You can upgrade to the pack storm. When you start to go to the regional class ocean vessel, it's like $35K a day. Geography is really expensive for us scientists. But I mean, we're not the only ones going out the ocean. Surely we can take advantage of the fact that there's so much ocean traffic. This is AIS. You can check if your crew is actually at the station that they're supposed to be in on the right time. Not that I do that. But we had a project that was funded by NOAA where we took advantage of the fact that the technology has gotten better, cheaper, more sophisticated, and we actually built these dissolved oxygen sensors that they're rugged. You just zip tie them right on the crab pot. They're smart. You don't have to open it to download the data. It's all wireless. Goes to a deck box and then brings it up to the cloud, and also plots it for people. And we gave out 40 sensors to try to map hypoxia. And this work was really led by my former grad student, Linus Stoltz, and working with one of the fishermen. This is Dave Bailey. And what's important is that now we have coverage. If you zoom in, then you get the data from different stations where the fishermen have been collecting data. And importantly, because of the funding support, we've been able to have fishermen put crab pots outside a couple of marine reserves, not inside. And that's been really important because remember I said, I thought last year we're not going to see hypoxia. Well, this is Dave Bailey's time series. Right at the end right at the beginning of August, we see that low dip. And two things that's important. One is that there was another sensor that was in slightly deeper water and recorded the same thing. So there's some confirmation that this was not just a one sensor error that got buried. The other is that they said there are dead crabs in the pot. So we had this confirmation for the first time. We had hypoxia was hand in the cookie jar because we could associate the dead crabs with this hypoxia event outside Otter Rock Reserve. So that was a program that leveraged a project that I had funded, me and my colleagues. What else can we leverage? In my other day job, I facilitate collaboration between NOAA and OSU, and we have a lot of NOAA colleagues at OSU campus here in Hatfield. And one that I want to highlight is the Newport Hydrographic Line team. So these are the fantastic people who go out to sea roughly every 2 weeks. And they go out across the shelf and they're giving us these pictures of how hypoxia is evolving. But not only that, this is a time series station. We've been also able to leverage scientists from PMEL, Dick Feely and Simone Allen, and they are actually doing some updating some analyses that Lori started, where you can take oxygen and get ocean acidification parameter, in this case, aragonite saturation state, from dissolved oxygen measurements. So now we're able to go back and forth in time with not just oxygen, but also ocean acidification. And this is also, it's a little different because these algorithms are being updated. We're leveraging NOAA's capacity to do that by taking samples on the NH line and also some of the other cruises that are happening. But the key is fish doesn't, as much as Burke and I like carbonate chemistry, last time we checked, fish didn't eat that. It's really about the feed, right? And this, now because we're adding OAH measurements on the NH line, we are now able to connect the dots to the base of the food web, because this is one of the premier time series program from observing food web ecosystem changes. And I'll end by asking, might knowing hotspots and refuges be important? Again, a lot of different neighborhoods to our coastal ocean. And as part of another project, again, there's too much work to be done, and I love sharing it with others. And I've been able to collaborate coastal groups where we deploy pH sensors, and these are really high quality pH sensors in the coastal zone, and we get this map. And what we're starting to see is, and this is a pattern that's repeating over time, we have neighborhoods where there are areas that persistently have the lowest pH, but we also have areas in the South Coast that we persistently see higher pH relative to other places, other marine reserves. So that's good, because we now have an understanding where are those hotspots and refuges. I'll end by thanks to the Oregon Ocean Science Trust that's supporting our ability to do this work, but also collaborators and partners. And I'll stop there.
We have time for 1 to 2 clarifying questions or follow-up questions.
Please.
Hi, thanks. Liz Perotti from NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program. If you had a wish list to increase your monitoring here on the California Current or Oregon coast, what would you do? Would it be climate quality cruises that are more frequent? Would it be real-time monitoring? What would you prioritize?
I would love, I think the most important thing is the biology is, we have a pretty good handle on the chemistry. It's like our ability to connect the dots, even though we're starting to get into the basic food web, I'll be able to connect the dot to, juvenile salmon, juvenile rockfish, things that, might be impacted, we think ought to be impacted. It's just so poor. Or how hypoxic zones that are coupled away, how that affects the distribution of everything from salmon to crab to hake. We need to know that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Cinamon Moffett. Cinamon Moffett is the Research Program Manager at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center located in Newport, Oregon, where she is responsible for the operational oversight of the research program infrastructure. She's also part of the emergency management team working to enhance the community's resilience to natural disasters. She holds 2 masters from the School of Marine Science at the University of Maine, one in marine biology with a focus on fisheries management and another in marine policy. Prior to joining Hatfield, Cinamon worked as a marine educator, a shellfish biologist, and an estuarine land use planner. Throughout her career, Cinamon enjoys working in, on, and around marine waters. Thanks, Cinamon.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, my name is Cinamon Moffett. I'm the research program manager here. I'll be presenting about a project that Bob Cowan and I are working on, and a lot of folks in this room, actually. And it might be a little bit different than some of the projects you're going to hear about today, because it's not going to be data loaded. It's going to be about adding monitoring capacity here at Hatfield. And so what we are working on is developing a long-term monitoring station out at our pump house. And we've been working on developing this idea for a little while, and it's because Uquina Bay here, right off of our coast, right off of our space here, is an important estuary. We have commercial fishers, we have recreational fishers, and we have the Hatfield Marine Science Center here since 1965. And so there's been a lot of monitoring that's happened over time, but a lot of that monitoring has been soft-funded, and it is come and it's gone. And so we really wanted to build a project that would be core to the infrastructure here at Hatfield and build our monitoring capacity. We'll do this. Okay. So in the fall of 2021, HMSC received some funds to renovate our pump house, our pier, and our groin from OSU Capital Improvement Funds. So HMSC wanted to take advantage of that opportunity to develop this separate little monitoring room out on our pump house. And so on the slide up here, you can see where Hatfield's located, and you can see that new pump house in construction at that moment. I'm having fun with my things. Okay, so what we were able to do with the capital funding is to build this little room in the corner of our pump house. It's a small little room, it's only about 50 square feet, but it is located in a place where we're able to pull water in situ from the bay, but also bring water up into the room. It is also co-located with all of the pumps for Hatfield. So this is where we pull in almost 1 million gallons of seawater every day goes to a reservoir and then goes out to all of our different, or most of our different buildings. And so knowing what's happening in our bay, but also knowing what's happening with the water coming into Hatfield was a really critical thing for us to think about. Having fun. I should know this system. I'm in this room all the time. All right. So the capital funds were able to give us that 50 square foot room that's in the corner there. We have a separate entrance, so that gives us control over security of who comes in and out of that space. And then we have this hole in the floor, very small little hole in the floor. It's about 32 inches by 12 inches wide. But what we do in that room and under that room is where we're going to go with the funding that we got from the House bill. I can't even decide how I'm doing it. All right, so we started working with stakeholders and community partners in the spring of 2021 to figure out what parameters we wanted to monitor and what pieces of equipment we wanted to put into this space. We decided to select some instruments that are meeting research standards, but are also used up and down the coast. So these are the core instruments that will be in this climate monitoring station. Many folks in the room are very familiar with these, and so I will do my best to talk about them, but there are others that know more. We are putting in YSI XO, which will replace the YSI 600 series that EPA has been monitoring out at the pump house for many years. The XO is going to collect pH, DO, turbidity, temperature, conductivity, and total algae. By replacing the old YSI with the new YSI, that allows us to crosswalk over to a new data set. So we're excited to be able to do that. We also worked with Seabird and had several pieces of equipment donated to us, and we're excited about those. So Seabird has donated a CFOX, actually 2 of them. And the CFOX monitors pH and optical DO. We also have the SUNA, which will give us nitrate, and the Eco Triplet, which will give us estimations of chlorophyll A and of CDOM. We also have the Burkolator, and Burke is in the room, so I can defer to him if we have questions about that. But as folks know, the Burkolator is definitely that piece of equipment that we need to be able to collect the information to monitor our ocean acidification. It collects PCO2 and total CO2, temperature, and salinity, and allows us to figure out the saturation state. All of these pieces of equipment will help us create a long-term, accurate, and reliable data set. And because many of these pieces of equipment we have in duplicate, we'll have one in the water and one on the shelf. So if one goes down, we'll be able to put one back up pretty quickly, and we won't have data gaps, which is also something we've been really thinking about and wanting to make sure that we were ready for. So with new design comes new challenges. Our old building sat on a whole bunch of old wooden pilings. On those wooden pilings, we were able to have a PVC well that the instrumentations would slide in and out of and protect it. Once we built the new pier, this new pier is built on concrete piles, and there's a lot less of them. And where the hole in the floor was not our choice. It was chosen by where the engineers felt that we could put a hole that size. So that meant we lost the well to anchor to the pilings to be able to put our instrumentation in. So We're getting creative, and everybody can kind of weigh in on this. But what we're working on is we're using a system that's similar to what EPA is using up in Tillamook, and we'll have these synthetic lines that are weighted and go down to the bottom, and then the instrumentation package will slide up and down these weighted lines. What you're seeing on the screen up there on the far side is basically an outer cage and an inner cage. The instrumentation packet sits in that inner cage. We'll be able to pull the entire unit up with winches in the room, and then the instrumentation package will separate and come into the room, and that is the piece that we'll have into the space. That is our attempt to deal with that small little hole that I was talking about, is so that the cage doesn't need to come into the room. You'll also notice that there are 8 lines going up and down, and that's because I haven't talked yet about the other thing that we're doing in the climate monitoring station is we'll have a sled that can hold test instruments. So the stuff we've been talking about is the core instrumentation that'll always be there and the things that we maintain, but we'll have this space where folks can come and test new pieces of equipment. They'll be able to have it in parallel with the instrumentation that we have in the water. So if you are a student and you've developed a new way to figure out what temperature is, you'll be able to put it down and put it in parallel with what we've got in the water. The other thing we can do is be able to put instrumentation for going out on a cruise into the system here and then train students on how to use that. So basically it's an empty open spot for us to play with that we're excited about. Okay, so when we were working with our stakeholders, we also talked a lot about who might use this type of data, and we identified these 4 different groups: researchers, resource managers, recreational and commercial users of the bay, and the general public. But in recognizing our users, we recognize that we also need to serve that data in different ways to be able to address their particular needs. So we designed not only the instrumentation package, but a back-end robust IT structure that would allow us to serve the data in many different ways. We also set this up to be very modular so that as new instrumentation became available, we'd be able to unplug something and plug something else in. So that sled is designed to be able to tear things off and put things back in pretty easily. Really making sure that we have that flexibility. We also wanted to make sure that we had room to grow, so that this IT infrastructure is set up to support the existing climate monitoring station we're building, but possibly to support remote sites around Yaquina Bay as well. The other thing that we're doing is building a ocean health exhibit in our visitor center. And so this is that public interaction piece that we were talking about, and we've been working with many folks in this room to develop that. I was hoping to show you some draft panels that we're putting out there, but they're not quite ready yet, but we're working on it. The idea is that the public also needs to understand and increase conversation around climate change effects on oceans and estuaries, and to improve visitors' literacy around data visualization. All of this is not possible without partnerships, like the piece of equipment on the screen. All those things need to work together in order for this instrument to work. And in this room is many, many, many partners that are a part of this project. We also wanted to leverage existing platforms, so we didn't have to build everything from the beginning. So we will be using Nanus to host and display our visual data. And then the other thing is that Hatfield is building this climate monitoring station into its core infrastructure. So that means it's no longer dependent on soft funding. It is part of who we are and what we'll be able to do moving forward. And I'm looking at Bob, and Bob is going to say yes. So it is built into our funding model. And so that really alleviates some of the stresses that we had to make sure that this data is long-term, is available, and is stable and robust. And I am well out of time.
Do we have any questions for Cinamon?
Card. No, no card. No, go ahead.
So this is a general question for you, also for the room, also for Bob. Just thinking about this station is such a great improvement in our monitoring network across the West Coast, and thinking that this is going to be such a great attractant for projects, and what is the vision of how that kind of collaborative project research coming into this area? What is that going to look like, and how can we help support that as a community?
Bob points back to me. Yeah, so we're developing as we go, Karin. Our vision is that somebody might be able to use that test sled for about up to 3 months, and they'll come to us and we can get them onto the schedule. But the details of how that works, we're not exactly sure. So I'm not advertising, well, I'm advertising it to you all right now, but it'll probably be a slow start, and then we'll figure out the method and the procedures to be able to do that. But we are really excited about having that test berth, because I think it adds something different to a monitoring station that we haven't had before.
Thanks. So we're also part of the Western Association of Marine Labs, WAML, which is a long-standing group. And what we're anticipating is that this will be a model for other labs up and down the coast. So we have a consistency in the type of data and the quality of data that we're collecting. So that's one of our longer-term goals as well.
Got one more question. All right.
Thank you, Cinamon. How deep is that sled? And what water depth can it go to?
Underneath the dock, we are hoping to set the sled depth at about 1 meter off the bottom, so that at extreme lows, we still have a bit of water over the top of the sled. That puts us, is T. Chris in the room? Yeah, T. Chris, about 24, 25 feet from the floor of the pump house, yeah? Yeah, so that's what we're looking at. We are working right now to figure out how to support the percolator and bring water up with that amount of lift. That is slightly outside of this particular funding pot of money, but we are working on that as well. So anybody who does pumping knows that that's quite a lift to pull water up. And so that has been an interesting challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So our next speaker is remote. It's Adi Nugraha. Adi is a senior research scientist at the Salish Sea Modeling Center at the University of Washington, Tacoma. He is one of the coastal ocean modeler experts for the development of the hydrodynamic and water quality model of the Salish Sea, and he also has long-term experience in applying the hydrodynamic and water quality models for climate change and anthropogenic impacts in estuaries and coastal areas. Take it away, Adi.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen right now?
We can't hear you. Yeah, give us a minute.
I'm actually sharing my screen. I hope it's working. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. It was
Great, we can hear you now.
okay.
If you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Oh yeah, I did already. Let me share again. How about right now? Can you see my screen?
Almost there. There, perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So let me start it. So yeah, today I'm gonna present the general overview of our project plan, which is involved in the mostly modeling, and then also the progress that has been complete so far from our project. So this project was funded by Oregon Ocean Science Trust to Salesi Modeling Center, University of Washington Tacoma. So first of all, I would like to thank to our project partner, including the University of Oregon, SSNR, and City Classy for their support. And this project just got started in October, so we are still in the initial stages. So the eelgrass has been known to be very essential for our society and ecosystem. A growing number of study has been found that estuary seagrass have local effect on carbonate chemistry, including the native Pacific Northwest eelgrass, Zostera marina. However, the importance of seagrass mitigation of on ocean acidification and hypoxia and the scale at which mitigation can be realized are still unknown. So it is particularly critical to understand how mitigation by seagrass translate at the estuary-wide scale under variable environmental condition. Our study was initiated by the fact that Pacific Northwest estuary are extremely vulnerable to ocean acidification due to the ocean upwelling, which bring carbon dioxide rich and low pH water to the coastal zone, which eventually influence the coastal ecosystem. This region has given us urgency in the research to understand the importance and the scale of seagrass mitigation to fight ocean acidification and hypoxia in Coos Bay. And the leverage of the existing water quality and eelgrass monitoring data, hydrodynamic circulation model, and biochemistry model have in addition support this important study. So we have selected several questions to better understand ocean acidification and hypoxia resilience and mitigation in Coos Bay. So to address this question, we have developed a biophysics model of Coos Bay, which include interaction between hydrodynamic, biochemical, and eelgrass process in the water column and sediment. Once created, the model could be used in the future to explore numerous additional research questions about change in climate, ocean process, and anthropogenic impact on Coos Bay. Our modeling study was actually initiated by the success of our three-dimensional Salesi model, which actually couple the hydrodynamic model and the water quality model in the offline mode. So the right figure is the schematic that explains how offline mode works. We initially run the hydrodynamics model and then eventually use the hydrodynamic output to calculate the transport of water quality variable with addition of the source and sinks term and eutrophication kinetics. Our 3D Salesi model has been broadly used in the several ocean acidification and hypoxia study related to nutrient pollution, climate change, sea level rise, future nutrient load, and the marine heat wave. And on the other hand, we set up our Coos Bay model based on recent hydrodynamic study by Dave Sutherland Group at the University of Oregon, using the same model to evaluate the estuarine exchange for flow variability. The biochemical model itself has 23 variables, which include carbonate chemistry process, zooplankton, eelgrass turbidity or light and benthic fluxes. In addition to that, the model include nutrient and sinks processed from the ocean, and then refer endpoint source input. As shown in the right figure, the eelgrass submeadow itself is divided into two compartments, above and below ground, which has their own kinetic that depends on the light availability, nutrient uptake, and mortality. So as part of the biochemical model, the eelgrass submodel has been implemented, tested, and validated in the Salix Sea. So we have used Washington State DNR data for eelgrass model calibration, as seen in the top right figure. And then the bottom figure shows the spatial extent of eelgrass above ground biomass model prediction in August 2014. So the calibration model parameter eventually were used for future climate change prediction of eelgrass biomass. So to provide detailed condition confer vulnerability to ocean acidification and hypoxia, we will produce a spatial temporal model output of simulated water quality variable and eelgrass biomass, which could identify spatial ocean acidification and hypoxia hotspot, as seen in the figure, and then analyze the eco-hydrological processes that either confer resilience and or enhance spatial temporal vulnerability to ocean acidification and hypoxia. We will also conduct such a scenario with and without eelgrass modeling to evaluate the alteration of pH and DO concentration variability by the eelgrass abundance. So this analysis will include the creation spatial temporal water quality variable difference map to estimate the influence of eelgrass on surrounding water quality. So we have planned to include outreach and dissemination in our study. Information and material from this study will be developed for public outreach. We also plan to make the model solution and analysis publicly available and share them with our project partner for future research. And lastly, our new funding will be published in the scientific journal. So we have made significant progress gathering and synthesizing existing water quality and eelgrass data from KUSBAI from various sources. The location for water quality data and has been collected as shown in the right figure. On the right is the layer of maximum observed eelgrass extent, which will be used for the initial condition of our eelgrass model. So in addition, we have collected point data to refine eelgrass biomass, specify composition and soot density within the maximum extent where is available. And putting together the water quality and eelgrass data are being used to set up the biochemical model, and in the next step will further to be used to calibrate the model output. Significant progress was also made in terms of model development. We have completed the model grid preparation and set up the hydrodynamic model for year 2014 run. The model was set up on University of Washington high performance computer. Our model also used the open boundary and river forcing as the previous modeling effort by the University of Oregon. On the right is a KUSBAI map that has river input as a blue dot and the hydrodynamic monitoring data as a black dot. So red insert figure show an example of model grid which has an average of grid size around 45 meter. And then right now we are working on the hydrodynamic model calibration and setting up the biochemical model. Our next step task will include the continuation of the setting up ILGAS model parameter and initial condition using spatial and temporal ILGAS data. Once the biochemical model achieves a stable operation status, we will proceed to model calibration and validation processes using the available water quality and the ILGAS monitoring data. So the model calibration will be such a tune-up process by minimizing the metric of the ILGAS biomass from the model and monitoring data from the tree station, as you can see in the right figure here. So yeah, this ends my presentation today. So feel free to reach out to Kathleen and me for future communication and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Adi. We do have time for a follow-up question from the room.
Thank you for that presentation. As somebody who is very engaged in Coos Bay estuary, I would encourage you to expand your outreach from some limited folks down in Charleston to talk to public people in the government, in the cities, and the county planning, because the estuary management plan is being reviewed right now with the possibility of making some changes. So I think this kind of information is essential. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Any other questions? Karen.
I would just point out Andy Lanier in the audience, who is part of DLCD's Ocean Coastal Management Program and is very involved in estuary management plans, is also an OAH Council member. And so those comments from you, Christine, are very on point, and thanks for making those suggestions.
Okay, our next speaker is Tony DeAndrea. Tony is the project lead for the ODFW Sea Corps project based in Newport, Oregon. Tony is an estuarine ecologist with over 20 years of experience in Oregon estuaries with a focus on shellfish and eelgrass population ecology. Tony came to ODFW in 2010 after an academic career at both Oregon State University and the University of Virgin Islands. Thanks, Tony.
Good morning. It's exciting to be able to talk about work that research group that I lead at ODFW and how we've developed techniques and methods to monitor Oregon's estuaries, particularly shellfish and habitat resources of the state. So the project I run is the SEEKER project, which is an acronym for Shellfish and Estuarine Assessment of Coastal Oregon. We have an overall mandate to generate baseline data on bay clam populations and habitats. And so much of our data that comes from our project includes things such as population patterns for bay clams, estuarine habitat mapping, tracking changes in shellfish and habitat resources, and public outreach, with an overall goal to provide the best available data to ODFW and the state to better manage our estuarine resources. To date, we have visited 6 estuaries, and I highlighted here on the right Tillamook Bay, since some of the information I'll share is some of our recent data in Tillamook Bay, and is also one of the first bays we've had the opportunity to revisit using the seeker team to look at changes that have happened in the last 10 to 12 years. And so when I talk about bay clams, I'm talking about essentially the 4 major bay clam species that are the focus of recreational and commercial fisheries in the state. So these include cockles, butter clams, gaper clams, and native littleneck. And so for our bay clam population monitoring approach, we look at a whole estuary scale. And so this map here in the center is from our Tillamook Bay study in 2010, and it shows essentially the intertidal and subtidal areas that were surveyed during that study. So we have 2 basic types of sampling that we do. We do sampling at sites that are just for habitat data. And so, and I have an example map here on the left that shows native eelgrass distribution from that survey. And then we have a number of other sites which are randomized throughout the intertidal and subtidal areas to both collect that same type of habitat data, but also collect the shellfish populations at those locations to essentially be able to describe the patterns in those populations that exist there. And although earlier I talked primarily about the bay clams, and that will be the focus of things that I'll talk about, we also take measurements on any shellfish that we collect during these surveys. And so this map here on the right is an example for cockle clams of the types of product that we can do from these surveys. And this shows the spatial distribution of cockle clam populations in intertidal and subtidal areas of Tillamook Bay from the previous 2010 survey. And so the information I'll present today is from our recent revisit of Tillamook Bay, which is the first of several years in that bay, in which we're again looking at intertidal bay clam populations here, and similar to that previous survey, using the comparable techniques to what we used before, we're looking at habitat-only sites as well as habitat and clam sites in these areas. And so this is in the same regions that were sampled in 2010. And we did have some additional funding from House Bill 3114 to essentially increase the capacity of seeker in order to implement this study. And so one of the things that we can do now that we've revisited some of these same areas is look at whether there have been some changes in the population distribution over time. So for these 3 areas that we surveyed this year, I've added on the cockle distribution from 2010. And then if we overlay essentially the population data that we collected this year, hope you can see that there have been some shifts in kind of the locations of where we find the cockles. And then actually we see a much more broader distribution of these species. And we can look at not just the distribution itself, but also look at the actual standing stock in terms of biomass between the 2 time periods. And not only is this increase in distribution of cockles, but there's also an overall increase in biomass of the species in these intertidal areas. And so we can look at all of these different bay clam species, and you see that there's a mix of increases in 2 species, decreases in 1 species, and then for native littlenecks, no change between those decades. And so we can look at some kind of what are these decadal shifts in the clam populations in these systems. A second component of the study is estuarine habitat mapping. And so these are examples of habitat maps that were produced from our 2010 to 2012 survey for eelgrass and sediment classes. And there are lots of broad users for this. ODFW uses this to manage our clam fisheries in the bay, as well as better understand clam habitat associations. And there's a broad spectrum of federal, state, and local governments and scientists that use this data for things like permit reviews, planners, and for example, here in Yaquina Bay, a large amount of the previous seeker survey in Yaquina Bay is being used as part of the update for the Yaquina Bay estuarine management plan. And so we can do a similar type of looking at changes in spatial distribution. In this case, we're looking at native eelgrass, Zostera marina in Tillamook Bay. And so this was the distribution that we found in 2010. And then if we overlay what we saw this year, some of the key things to see is that there have been some spatial shifts in the distribution that have been apparent since the previous survey. And there's been a general expansion of eelgrass in this location. And this contrasts greatly with what we found in a couple of other Oregon estuaries, such as in South Slough and Coos Bay, as well as in Yaquina Bay, where we'd seen a general decrease in eelgrass. However, one of the challenges we have for resources like eelgrass is that there are some temporal limitations to how we do our surveys, in that they tend to be decadal changes. And so we have these snapshots every 10 years. And so one of the other things that we've been doing with the funding we received is to explore other ways to get some more rapid types of data. And so one of these ways that we've done this is using uncrewed aircraft system, or UAS, to do some rapid imagery of some of these areas. And so the current study we have ongoing in Tillamook Bay is a focus on 5 regions of the bay where we had known eelgrass beds from previous studies, as well as an area that was a subject of a recent aquaculture permit. And so this is an example of one of the images. And so this was a single flight on a single tide that we were able to do for this tide flat in the northeastern portion of Tillamook Bay. And if you zoom in that blue area, you can see that we can identify several different types of habitat types. So we can see both continuous dense eelgrass, as well as patchy eelgrass, areas of macroalgae, as well as unvegetated areas of this. And so we're still post-processing this imagery for classifying eelgrass habitat. And then we're also going to be repeating these surveys in this upcoming year to then look at some interannual changes in eelgrass that we can observe during this time frame. And although I can't show you kind of the classified eelgrass from this year, just it's instructive to look at what we've done in some previous estuaries, looking at this same type of year-to-year variation in eelgrass. So one of the places we've done this is in Netarts Bay, which is also on the north coast of Oregon, but just south of Tillamook Bay. And this shows essentially classified habitat in flights that were done in 2016 to 2017 in the same 2.5 acre area. So we were able to classify 3 different habitat types, 2 macroalgae types, as well as eelgrass. And then you can see that there are some shifts that you can see even in a single year. And so obviously these types of shifts are ones that we can't detect with our regular kind of field survey. And so this approach allows us to generate some finer resolution habitat maps to better track the spatial temporal dynamics of eelgrass within the timeframes that are relevant for the biology of these species. And it also can be a rapid response tool for emerging natural resource issues that we can utilize this type of tool for. So in summary, kind of the investment has helped build the expertise and infrastructure for the ODFW Marine Resources Program to monitor estuarine shellfish and habitat. And that the types of data that are being produced by the project provides insights on the decadal scale changes to bivalves and estuarine habitats within Oregon estuaries. And these are important data sets needed to quantify baselines and identify whether changes related to environmental factors such as ocean acidification or climate change are within or greater than outside of the background noise that's naturally occurring within these populations. And then finally, we're investing in and developing newer technologies that are permitting us to increase the spatial temporal resolution of the habitat mapping component of that. Unfortunately, we have not been able to use the UAS to help with any of the bivalve component of the study, but it has been a very effective tool looking at important habitat types such as eelgrass. And with that, I'll take any questions you have.
We got a question back there.
What's the error of, like, what's your margin of error for your monitoring for eelgrass? Is it like a meter? Like, how accurate can you get with the remote viewing?
Okay. Could you restate, were you thinking of the field surveys or the UAS surveys? Okay. So for the field surveys, the accuracy or kind of pixels in those maps on order of 9 to 10 meters. Whereas that can be on orders of centimeters to decimeters for the drone flights. Yeah, it's misleading when you look at very large areas and lots of points when a lot of those points are separated by like 100 meters in distance.
Thanks, Tony. I was, of course, intrigued to see the difference in the response of the different bivalves. Increase in cockles, increase in butter clams, but a decrease in gaper clams. Can you share any perspectives about what may be behind that difference in the biological response of those 3 different clam species?
Well, yes, to some degree. Well, for butter clams, it's not surprising because we've seen, particularly in the last few years, kind of a very large recruitment event across a large number of estuaries. And also some recent work done in Washington State have shown that on a decadal scale, butters have been, in general, increasing. Cock is a little harder to do because they're a very short-lived species and they have lots of booms and busts in their population. So whether we just caught them in kind of a boom period relative to when we previously surveyed is unknown. Obviously, with a decadal scale survey, there's only so much interpretation you can do out of that. And then for gaper clams, they're much more longer lived and have very patchy reproduction and can be almost every 8 or 10 years is really good gaper year. And so having sometimes high and sometimes low populations is not unexpected, particularly for the intertidal areas.
Tony, Alex Manderson with Department of Agriculture. With your clam sequel work, are you expanding that to include crustaceans? I'm getting some pretty alarming reports out of the commercial oyster industry about proliferation of burrowing shrimp and green crab with the pretty real potential to cripple that industry in a lot of the bays right now. And information on what that's looking like on the ground would be really helpful.
Yeah, Alex, great question. Those are actual species that we directly measure in all of our surveys. So both in terms of the habitat data, we do things like burrow hole distribution of the different shrimp species, as well as from the shellfish populations. We also measure all of the crustaceans as well as bivalves that we get in our samples.
We have one more question.
Hi, Tony. Thanks. Funding question. So kind of tagging along what Francis Chan said earlier today about having investment in biological response being a priority for the Oregon coast here. Of your shellfish that you're managing, what would be your priorities? Given that we're starting to invest in Dungeness crab already, do you have kind of a priority list for that? Or is it more a development or an investment in these technologies like UAS?
I think it's more twofold because obviously the new technologies are very promising in what they can generate on a fairly short time. They do require a certain amount of expertise to post-process and work with that data. But I think that we also need kind of an investment in our core field teams, because obviously we're doing it at a decade scale, and that's primarily based on, you know, the amount of personnel time it takes to kind of do those types of surveys. You can see the scale that we're working with for those surveys. And so increased investment in that aspect of the project would also allow for things like addition of sentinel sites, which then might be able to monitor bivalves on a more frequent basis, and or just increase our capacity to complete estuaries more rapidly and be able to revisit them, say, on an 8 or 9 year or less cycle versus the 10 to 12 that we're currently at.
Thanks, Tony. Our last speaker of the session is Burke Hales. Burke is a professor in ocean ecology and biogeochemistry in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. He has degrees in chemical engineering and chemical oceanography from the University of Washington and has served as a Department of Energy Distinguished Postdoctoral Fellow in Climate Change at Columbia University before joining the faculty at Oregon State. Dr. Hales has a long record of publication and technical innovation in ocean science research, particularly with regard to ocean chemistry and carbon cycling. Thanks, Burke.
Thank you. Can folks hear me? All right, excellent. Well, so I didn't put Whiskey Creek in the title, but Whiskey Creek is really sort of where this all began. And I wanted to point out a really important feature of this kind of work and the kind of support and the kind of community engagement that we did, because it's not the kind of work you could get funded through a normal open research grant kind of activity. The fact that the states were willing to support us to put these instruments in facilities with the stakeholders, the fact that the stakeholders themselves were collecting the biological data that's really important to link to this to these measurements that we're making. You just couldn't do that in a sort of a normal proposal call. And what we found out is that the devil's in the details, right? So the things that a lot of people would try to just do away with in terms of data processing, this is where the answers lay. And I want to point out, Lori pointed out that I got my PhD in Seattle in 1995. And in the 90s in Seattle, we all learned to hear some different things. Okay, lots and lots of work has gone into this. And a couple of these are really Whiskey Creek featured. First one up here, I'm going to show a number of data slides from this, is Will Fairchild's master's thesis work, working up 6 years of the continuous chemistry measurements at Whiskey Creek. The other one is this really nice, is this a, oops, what have I done? Is there a laser pointer? Can I point at things? Which one is it? The lower one? No? Over here is a really nice piece of work that Wiley Evans, my former PhD student, put together looking at the network of, thank you, Chris. Now I got to do two-handed. All right. For the Oceans and High CO2 World Conference in Lima, Peru last fall. And then, of course, some work that we've done with support of the shellfish industry and the states to look at the time series of what's going on in Willapa Bay in the same context. The Whiskey Creek story. This is the paper that Alan Barton, and you probably can't see the list of names here. Familiar cast of characters, some folks in the room here, some folks that have already been mentioned. Whiskey Creek was sort of Alan Barton, the hatchery manager, talked about Whiskey Creek being the canary in the coal mine for the ocean acidification and shellfish problem, and saying it's being the canary in the coal mine is a horrible role to play because the canary dies. And in the late aughts, the shellfish industry hatcheries started to collapse regionally, not just at Whiskey Creek. But Alan was really unique in his outreach to the research community to try to get assistance in this, and finally reached out to us around in here, and we started putting instrumentation at the Whiskey Creek hatchery in conjunction with the very high resolution larval success data that Alan was collecting as part of his business operation. And then based on some smoking guns that came out of that work, George Waldbusser and his team and I, Chris Langdon, who's here in the room, started to do some detailed experimental work looking at what the actual effect of the ocean acidification chemistry was. And the thing about carbonate chemistry, and Francis noted this early in the morning, that some of us really love to talk about it. Not very many of us, but some of us love this. And carbonate chemistry is fundamentally multivariate. You change one parameter in the carbonate system, everything else changes in response, and you don't necessarily know without detailed experimental work which parameter the system responds to. In this work, we were able to separate out the effects of pH, PCO2, and this aragonite saturation. And what we found is that you really couldn't find clear effect in either the PCO2 or the pH, but there's a clear multi-species, multi-cohort response to omega. This is this stability factor for the shell mineral that the organisms produce in their early life cycle. The other part of this that we found out with other work that I'm not showing here is that the sensitivity is at very critical life stages that sometimes last a matter of hours, right? So going out and sampling once a month, getting data from 2 months prior, like Francis talked about, it's not good enough. You have to know things in real time, and you have to be able to time your operations as a stakeholder to be able to take advantage of good conditions and bad conditions, and you have to know how to be able to modify those conditions. This is where the percolator came in. I have to point out, every time I say that, it makes me a little uneasy, and that it was Mark Wiegert who actually named this, and it had this name for about 2 years before I ever knew about it. This is one of the devices up in British Columbia. Wiley put in there. This system is what will go in the pump house out here. We're able to measure the complete carbonate system with this instrument. It measures PCO2 and total CO2, which allows us to calculate everything else. pH, probably better than you can measure it directly, and this all critical omega system, or omega parameter. We're starting to expand this network from Southern California all the way up into the Gulf of Alaska. This is a slide from Wiley's presentation, but we're doing really well here. We're starting to do well here, and the Alaska and BC system run under Wiley's supervision is they're kicking ass. I mean, they're really doing well. This instrument is made to be lay user friendly, but there has to be investment by the stakeholder to keep these things running. You know, seawater gets dirty, filters clog, things flood. And if you don't have that commitment on the ground, it really doesn't work. Okay, the noise. This is from Will's paper. The highlighted year in gray is 2017. Every other year from 2014 to 2019 is here in these representations. And almost anyone would look at this and say, oh my God, the noise is ridiculous. You can't interpret this because it's just all noise. And it's not noise. This is the signal. And I'll show you this in a couple of slides, hopefully, to convince you that this is right. Right, so here's our pH, our calculated pH, here's our omega. Here's our fundamental PCO2 and TCO2 measurements, right? And all years in composite. One of the parameters that's really useful and diagnostic for us is this alkalinity parameter that we can calculate. This tells us a lot about source water, where the water is coming from, what's doing the dilution of the salinity. And we can see the difference between rainwater and Columbia River water and open California current water in this regard. But again, if you look at this in composite, it looks like noise. But when you start pulling it apart and looking at it in detail, this is the actual data, and it is in no way noise, right? This is mechanistic, it is responsive. Things are covariant, they have coherence with the environmental driving factors, right? And so this is what's there, and you have to make these measurements at this kind of resolution to be able to tease these things apart, because there's clearly a strong diel character there, but there are sub-hourly variability in these parameters that are real signals, and these matter to the organisms at these critical life bottlenecks. And again, to come back to this alkalinity parameterization, these are 3 different instances. This is a spring situation at Netarts where the bay is actually being freshened from the ocean by the Columbia River plume. This is a wintertime, well, earlier spring, late winter situation where we're being freshened by local precipitation, right? This is actually the very small streams, the very high rainfall associated with winter storms. And you see dramatically different alkalinity to salinity relationships here. This one with an end member that clearly indicates the Columbia River. This one with an end member that's very low that clearly indicates rainwater. And here in the summertime, there is no alkalinity dependence on salinity whatsoever, and yet there is coherent diel signal, which is the metabolism of the bay, suboxic processes and calcification. The noise is site dependent, right? And Wiley put this together where he was looking at the diel amplitude, one of the stronger temporal signals in the data at different locations. And here at Whiskey Creek, we've got a very large average diel amplitude, but it can also vary by huge amounts. You look at the Fanny Bay oyster system, it's very similar, a little bit less. But then up here in Sitka, Alaska, it's much, much smaller, right? And much less variant. And these variances in the PCO2, of course, correspond to variances in this all-important omega. And the noise is the effect, right? This is where the problems start to happen. This is where systems are impacted. This again is from Will's situation or data here. And what we want to point out is this is a histogram of the frequency of occurrence of omega conditions. And I want to point out that basically right in here, right around 1.7 is where we start to see chronic effects on larval shellfish at this level of omega. And the blue stippled lines are what we believe the distribution would have been in the pre-industrial condition, in the absence of atmospheric CO2, in the absence of ocean acidification. The distribution sits right up here, right around 2, 1.9, something like that, on the positive side of the chronic threshold. And now we sit down here basically on top of what we think the acute threshold for actual survival impingement is. This is, again, another important paper. Steve Pacella wrote this. It's in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, looking at eelgrass impacts on the onset of ocean acidification, occurrence of conditions of omega, and in the absence of eelgrass and in the presence of eelgrass. And the presence of eelgrass and the variance, the noise that presents to a system makes you feel the effects sooner, but protects you longer, right? In the absence of this noise, you get a step function of essentially non-survival, whereas in the presence of it, you start to feel the effects sooner, but you have mitigative effects longer. And then the last one here, this is a frequency of occurrence of favorable conditions for spawn and larval survival in Willapa Bay, from a paper that I have not published yet. And essentially the black line is the frequency of occurrence of good years that have a combination of proper thermal forcing and proper omega conditions. How long have you been up? I'm almost done. This is the last slide. And the red is the distribution of frequency of those events now. And what we see is that the frequency of favorable conditions for spawn and set in Willapa Bay has dropped by about a factor of 3, from about every other year to about every 8 years, because of the noise. Okay, so conclusions: oversample. You want as much data as you possibly can because you don't know what's there if you don't sample it, right? We didn't know that sub-hourly variability was important. We didn't know we could measure it. We didn't know it would be impactful to the organisms, right? Be cautious about data reduction. Taking all this data and just running it through filters to reduce the noise loses information. Be careful with this. And listen to the noise. Questions?
Questions for Burke?
The folks online can't hear unless we use the mic for our recording too.
Thank you. Thanks, Burke. Your last slide certainly addresses my question. We're about to set up the percolator at the dock here. For an estuarine setting, what do you recommend for sample frequency? 15 minutes?
No,
No?
no, continuous.
Oh, continuous.
Yep, keep
Okay.
that pump going.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
There's a question over here somewhere.
I'm coming.
Here, I'll,
Thank you.
Burke, thanks. Thanks so much for all your great work here. Complex question in 3 parts. First part, can you clarify just the difference between day-night photosynthesis and respiration and the important effects of tides also occurring? That's part 1. Part 2, by showing us about the importance of early larval development and the effects of aragonite saturation. In your opinion, are our wild stocks of clams more susceptible on the way out, from populations that have been spawned inside the bays and estuaries and then going through early development from that source inside the bay versus larvae that have come from the open ocean, distant locations, and swept up into the bays? And the third part, which one of these characters up there is you?
Well, I'll say that 2 of those guys are dead. So that eliminates a few choices. First part, Diel versus tidal. Yeah. Will, are you here? No, Will. Boy. Forsaken. Yeah, because we sampled with really, really high frequency and with really long persistence, we can see, because the tides advance, we can see the diel signal persist as the tidal signal moves forward, right? And that's in that Frontiers paper of Will's, right? Because that was something that, we argued about quite a bit. And, again, Alan Barton knew the answer before we, proved him right. But Alan said, no, it's diel. And we said, no, well, you can't tell. It's all this tidal stuff and, week to week variability. He said, no, but it's diel. And yeah, sure enough, it's there. Now you can see the diel signal's amplitude change, right? There's still a diel signal in winter, even in really cloudy, stormy conditions, right? So you can see that amplitude change. You saw that in the synthesis that Wiley put together with the amplitude shifting seasonally. And then of course, because as the tide shifts, right, you have this character of the diel and the tidal. And so in Will's paper, we have, 90-degree out of phase tidal system or situations with the diel signal persisting and show those side by side. So that was the diel one. What's worse, being in the bay or being in the ocean? And there's another question there that you didn't ask, but I'm going to answer anyway. So what's worse, being in the bay or being in the ocean? I can't tell you, right? Because the organisms have life stage sensitive or life stage dependent varying sensitivities to ocean acidification chemistry. And they have, in George's terms, they have these bottlenecks, right? So right at spawn, right at fertilization, they're very, very sensitive because they build shell almost, entirely. Go from no shell whatsoever to have a complete fully formed shell within like 4 to 6 hours, right? And that period there, if the chemistry is bad, they don't make it. They also have a sensitivity at settlement. But once they get to, sort of juvenile to adult stage, they start to be less sensitive to OA chemistry and start to be more sensitive to feed, substrate, those sorts of things. So I don't think I answered your question. What I will say is that you didn't ask about mussels, right? And I, excuse me, I always try to remind people about this. We saw in this experimental work with Chris and George and others, we saw that the native mussels that we chipped off rocks at Seal Rock brought in, cultured, spawned, ran through the treatments, they have the identical response to the non-native mussels, to the oysters. This is where the Oregon coast ecosystem is going to fall apart, right? And then, yeah, which one is me? This is the screaming trees, right? Who never made it as big as they should have because they were so ugly. All right, anything else?
Up, who is going to be talking about best management practices for Oregon estuaries and shellfish. I'm struggling on whether to say shellfish or oysters. Shellfish, she says, because this project in particular is very directly related to the Shellfish Task Force that I mentioned previously. And we are so grateful to have you here from San Diego and in our midst today. Thank you for joining us and look forward to your talk. I'm not going to, would you give a couple of words of who you are and why you're here?
Absolutely. Yeah, happy to. Okay, so I am, can you hear me? Okay, I'm adjunct faculty at San Diego State, and I also work a lot with colleagues at Oregon State University. And I'm co-PI Brian Katz, who's also in the audience, and project team member Annie Merrill. And we are working on a project to develop best management practices or community guidelines for the sustainable management of submerged aquatic vegetation and shellfish, which is a broad-reaching and somewhat tall order, and we'll see where we get with that. So like I mentioned, we're trying to use community input and also the best available science to develop best practices and a guidance document. And when we say SAV and shellfish, we mean most typically, based on how these interactions are occurring, seagrass and oysters, but that could also mean other types of SAV, so macroalgae, and it could also mean other types of shellfish, both farmed or wild shellfish. So we are trying to capture all of that in the project to the best of our ability. So we know that they interact in a number of ways, and potentially most relevant to this group based on the title of the symposium is the way they interact in a water chemistry context. So there's recent research to suggest that the pH can be, a below pH can be ameliorated by SAV, which can then translate to improved calcification or growth in oysters. There's some evidence from statewide work in California that shows that the pH can be elevated by 0.1 pH units for over 21 days, right? So there's new research coming online to suggest that not only does it happen, but it can happen in a way that's significant to a calcifying organism. And that has put the interactions between SAV and shellfish back on the forefront of people's minds, looking at how they could potentially facilitate one another. But they don't only interact in the context of OAH, right? They interact in a huge number of ways, both environmental and in a management and policy context. So they could reduce disease prevalence in seawater. They both support diverse assemblages of organisms, their structural habitats. They can improve water quality. And then there's negative environmental interactions through shading and light reduction, changes to sediment chemistry that could be detrimental to one or the other. And then there's the suite of management and policy interactions. So the physical damage that could be caused by harvesting shellfish, either recreationally or commercially, and then changes to hydrodynamics, shading of one or the other by the culture equipment or the grass on top of the shellfish. So unfortunately, we can't select only the OAH benefit in a realized management of these two groups of organisms. Is there a timer on here? Yes, okay. So like I said, we're aiming to develop a guidance document, and part of that is done through a survey to try to get stakeholder input on all of these different things. Stakeholders, rights holders, meaning land managers, SAV restoration practitioners, shellfish farmers, shellfish recreational harvesters, macroalgae harvesters, so we're doing our best to get a broad scope of this survey, and we've just started sending it out. I think we have about 16 or 17 responses, and I'll show you some preliminary results from that. And also, In the winter or fall of next year, we'll come together and have a workshop to try to pull together some of these findings and get additional input. So I wanted to share a little bit about what we've seen from those surveys and also some of the general perceptions. We have a multitude of commentary and quotes on the perception of SAV by shellfish growers, and I thought it was actually worth it to just kind of read some of these because it's interesting to hear the sort of boots on the ground approach to how they're interacting. So the top two quotes here kind of explain what we see with the perception that they're positive influence on one another. So this grower says, I think the oysters are positive for eelgrass. You see areas where there's no oysters and you'll see scattered tufts of eelgrass during summer months, but you will not see beds of eelgrass like you will within the oyster beds. Second grower says, you see a lot of marine life really thriving, whereas in areas where the sand shrimp is, you won't see any other marine life. That's really interesting because they like to be able to hide amongst the shells and amongst the eelgrass. So single folks' perceptions, but these are people that are also out on the water all the time. And then there's also a suite of negative interactions that can be perceived. This grower says, the third one, now I can't hardly see the bottom. The grass grows so tall that it lays on top at the low tide and sinks the oysters. So a lot of this depends on how they're culturing the shellfish, depends on if it's on bottom or off bottom culture and how that happens, but they can interact in negative ways. And then there's the suite of policy and management implications. For example, the last quote on here, the Army Corps of Engineers, ODFW, say we can only farm 10% of that. And here's the reason why. Where they're saying, well, there's too many native clams or there's too much eelgrass on that plot for you to farm it. It's hard to explain and it changes so often. So that last part, it changes so often, is a lot of the challenge, I think, for shellfish farmers, that they are seeking flexibility, and it can be a challenge to respond to environmental changes with policies and management frameworks that are relatively inflexible. So trying to think about what that means for the actual co-management of those two groups. So to give you a sense of kind of what we're hearing, this is the very preliminary results from these surveys. And we have responses from 3 commercial aquaculturists. This is self-identified user group. We did not make these designations. Academics/researchers, recreational harvesters, natural resource management and managers, and SAV restoration practitioners. So this first graph, I mentioned that the OAH amelioration potential has put this sort of how do we sustainably co-manage question back on the forefront. At the same time as that's happening, there's also a sort of pulse of interest in aquaculture, particularly macroalgae and shellfish, perceived to be quite sustainable. And you can see that in these survey results, that most people agree that Oregon should support and expand sustainable shellfish aquaculture in the state. So it's clear that many people think it is a good thing, but that doesn't mean we know how to do it best. So granted, you don't have a ton of survey results here, and I'm sure we'll see these change as we get more input, but it's interesting to see just the tip of the iceberg here. We also asked questions in these surveys about OAH specifically, so also clear that people believe that OAH does pose a threat to farmed and native shellfish. And for the most part, people agree that SAV can lessen the impacts of OAH on farmed and native shellfish. Again, though, those things are not happening in a vacuum. And when you dig in a little bit deeper to try to understand the actual full suite of interactions and ask if co-location of SAV and farmed shellfish can benefit farmed shellfish, most people agree on that standpoint. But when you switch that around and ask if the co-location of the two can benefit the SAV, there's a lot less certainty about whether or not that co-location benefits the eelgrass populations or other SAV. So a mixed review. The other types of questions on here, this is a selection of questions. There's about 20 or so questions on there. These questions focusing on the sort of management and policy. So Oregon should permit shellfish aquaculture to occur up to the edge of SAV population. So this is a big question about what kind of buffer do you leave between the shellfish and the seagrass, and what should our policies recommend? Not a whole lot of agreement on that question. And there's a lot of science that can be used to inform this, but we're still sort of progressing on that. And then similarly, some methods of shellfish harvest are more detrimental to SAV than others. So there are some methods like dredging, for example, that happens in a couple of areas in Oregon still that could potentially be more detrimental to SAV than other things like off-bottom culture. And so making informed decisions about where and what kind of culture you're allowing to happen can change how the management occurs and can change the impacts to the recipient populations. So that's a look on the survey data. And I'm going to skip ahead. What we're starting to put together is how we're going to visualize all this information. And so Brian Katz is in the audience and is leading a lot of the mapping efforts. And so some of those questions are not spatially explicit questions. They're just general perceptions. But also some of those, that's really blurry, isn't it? Sorry about that. I'll give you the general idea, but some of the questions are spatially explicit. So somebody who's harvesting in a particular bay. And so we're going to frame all of this where it can be spatially explicit onto a mapped layer. And so this is one output product. And then the other part of that is the other pieces of information, which is very similar to one of the talks you heard earlier, where we've laid the eelgrass data we have and native shellfish and farmed shellfish leased areas onto a map that you can also look at those layers to get an idea of where potential interactions are occurring. So we have farmed lease area, but we also know that often they're not farming the whole lease area. Only a fraction of those leases get farmed. And so it can be useful information, but it's still limited. So trying to understand spatially where these things are interacting so that as we make recommendations, we can look at where those interactions are happening and try to sort of plan accordingly. So I'll pretty much stop there. So I think I'm close to out of time. And I would ask, though, that you take our survey and share our survey and keep your eyes peeled for the winter workshop. A lot of people said, well, I can't answer all the questions in this survey. And I would encourage you to just skip those questions and take the survey anyways. So there's a QR code for that. And I actually might be able to follow up via email with participants with a link also. Awesome. That would be enormously helpful to us. So, all right, I'll leave it at that.
So we do have time for a question or two. Anybody?
Hi, thank you. I know you're in the middle of your survey process, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your target audiences that you want to participate in, and if indigenous groups and tribes were a specific target, and if you had a specific outreach plan for that.
Yeah. So it's a tall order with a short project if you don't have like long-standing existing relationships. So I'm trying to the best of my ability to use the conduits with existing relationships with tribes that we do have through myself and through other project partners and collaborators. And so absolutely, we have targeted outreach for as much as we can get. And we're trying to use that. In the very least, include some section within the management guidelines that recognizes that this is not ubiquitously applied across all land and sea and across user group. And so we have been working with some tribes on that, but it's been a little bit of a slow process, but we're going to keep moving forward with that. Yeah.
One more, I'm going to go to Alex here. And then we'll be fine.
I could be like Steve and ask a multi. I was just wondering how you have reached out to these user groups and if it's pair. So I've not been aware of the survey, and I'd love to be able to help and try to, get the commercial industry to participate. I know they're not the most participatory group sometimes with government, but I think if they understand the benefits of having their voice heard, they will. So I'd love to help out. So
That's,
take a picture of the QR code.
that's
right
great.
now.
That's exactly what we want to hear. So we just started maybe a month ago trying to push this survey out. So we're still early in the effort. Also realizing that with a lot of the shellfish growers, it's better to just drive there and say hi and ask questions. So we will also be taking that approach. We're trying to, we will try anything that we can to get enough input as possible. So, so far it's mostly been through emails. We sent it out to a bunch of different networks. It was in the PMEP science letter. We sent it out to the native shellfish, what's the consortia? I forget the acronym. We've sent it out to as many colleagues as possible. So we're blasting it out through our own networks, but also I'm an academic, so that's not the only network out there. So yeah, we're doing our best.
So we're going to move on. If you have ideas on how Melissa can increase her amplification of this message and that QR code, please let Jenny know. And we are going to move on to, a round of applause again for Melissa. Thank you, Melissa. So in the Oregon Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Action Plan, there is a call for biological data, and we've had that as a theme today, is really looking at biological information. And so we have Marlena here from the Waldbusser Lab, who is going to talk to us about some of that biological data that is being collected now due to this House bill investment. So Marlena is in George Waldbusser's lab. She's in her first year of an MS program with the Marine Resource Management program. And thank you so much for joining us. Oh, okay, Stahl. Okay, she got her bachelor. Oh no, okay, go ahead. Take it away, Marlena.
Sharing our screen again.
Oh, did I ruin that?
It's all good.
And Jenny have something in common, which is that they both have a connection in Florida.
The more you know.
Oh yeah, good old Florida.
We lured them here to Oregon for good outcome.
Yeah, thank God.
All right, there you go.
Okay, cool. So I will be talking about Olympia oyster growth and resilience to climate change. Hopefully you all know where you're sitting on this map. We're at the Hatfield Marine Science Center, which is one of our study sites furthest to the ocean. Our lab has been monitoring Yaquina Bay for about 5 years, all the way from Hatfield up to Cannon Quarry, and that covers about 21.5 kilometers of the estuary. We have a ton of different information that we're collecting. The shapes indicate where in the water column we are collecting temperature data. And the colors correspond to conductivity, turbidity, and the sites that we have Olympia oysters growing at. I will be focusing on all those sites in pink. So the lower end of the estuary, Hatfield, King Slough, Sawyer's Landing, Pool Slough, and Oyster Farm. In the summer months, we visit these sites bi-weekly, and during that time, we're doing discrete samples and downloading data. In the winter, we do this on a monthly basis. All of the oysters that have been outplanted have been, they've been weighed and photographed on a monthly basis as well. Olympia oysters have a very sad history here in the Pacific Northwest. They are the only native species, and yet they are very understudied and were nearly extirpated from many of the estuaries, including here in Yaquina. They were overharvested in the 1800s and 1900s, leading to population declines. We are fortunate enough to have a lot of natural recruitment here in Yaquina. Olympias like to settle on hard substrates, and this typically includes the cultured Pacific oyster, and that's here in the photograph on the right. You have Olympia oysters settling on these Pacific oysters. And because of that, that's why we were able to get individual Olympias from Oregon Oyster Farm to use in this study. Prior work from our lab analyzed the dissolution rates of Olympia shells and Pacific shells at different saturation states of calcite. Interestingly, we found that Olympia shells had, when averaged across these 3 sites, a 30% higher dissolution rate. This went against a lot of general hypotheses that a species that is exposed to recurrent upwelling conditions would be more resilient to these changes in saturation state. With this history of Yaquina in mind and prior work on Olympias, our lab is using a space for time experimental design here in Yaquina. We have 500 oysters outplanted at those 5 different sites, so 100 oysters at each site. We've conducted shell and tissue samples. We have expanded our particulate sampling and discrete sampling, and have also conducted spatial surveys. Getting into some of this environmental data, we have average daily temperature in the solid lines and average daily salinity in the dashed lines from this past June until December. It was mentioned before that we had a very, very long downwelling season. It went 60 days past average this year. So upwelling didn't start until June and it ended in October. We weren't able to get oysters large enough until July, which was about a month to 2 months past what we were planning. So because of that, we had a very short kind of like growing season this year. And I also want to point out that all these colors indicate the different sites that we have, and these colors are going to be the same throughout the rest of the presentation. Hatfield, again, is our most ocean-dominated site, so it's typically the coldest with higher salinity. And as you work your way all the way up to Pool Slough and Oyster Farm, it gets warmer and not as salty. In the summer months, we have very large distinctions between these sites, and as we enter the rainy season and the winter months, the sites converge to pretty cold 10, 9-ish degrees Celsius. It's not fun when you're sticking your hand in and taking a bottle sample. And we also get these really big fluctuations in salinity because of all that rain. One of the parameters we are taking is the wet weight of an Olympia oyster. And so each individual oyster is getting put on a scale. They're kind of damp and dried. And I also want to point out that this wet weight is mostly a measure of the shell mass. The body of an oyster is approximately 1/3 of this. So just keep that in mind, that a lot of this weight is in the shell. And for the graph on the left, you have the number of days since outplanting. So day 0 occurred in July, and it goes down to the dates that we were out in September. And this is just the average wet weight of the population at that site with standard error bars and linear regression. Interestingly enough, Pool Slough follows like a great linear growth. You can see they all started at slightly different weights, and that's why on the right, I have each site and the average change in wet weight. And so that's how much weight was actually gained during this growing period. And what we found is that at Sawyer's Landing, they gain about 0.4 grams per week, which is kind of a lot when you think about how small these oysters are. They only weighed on average 4.8 grams to start. So they were putting on a lot of body mass. And you kind of see at Hatfield and King Slough, they're very similar along with Oyster Farm. And at Pool Slough, they grew very linearly, but they didn't gain as much weight. We are also measuring shell area of these oysters, and that's just how large the oyster actually is. And so again, we have the number of days of outplanting from July to September in the average area, which is in centimeters squared. Area growth doesn't follow a very linear trend or anything that we've been able to kind of like identify so far. And I also have the average change in area from July to September. What I think is really interesting and what will be cool to continue to look at in this next growing season is how you see an increase in shell area as you move in the estuary, and then it drops a little bit. I think this will be something for us to look at and really further examine the carbonate chemistry at these sites, because we know there's the salinity and temperature gradients, but there's also these other environmental variables changing as you move up the estuary. I am going to get into the effects of saturation state of calcite on the change in what we're calling a shell density proxy. And all of the data presented is going to be an average of the discrete sample taken from the start and end of a growing period. For saturation state, again, something above 1 means there's plenty of building blocks available to make calcite, and below 1 is when you would start seeing dissolution. Organisms still produce their shell under low saturation states, which is important to remember. For this the shell density proxy, we are using the wet weight divided by the area, because if we were to sample enough oysters every month to have a good understanding of their actual shell density, we would have to kill them. And so that would reduce our sample size in the field, and we don't want to be killing off a bunch of Olympia oysters that we don't want to. So we're using this weight to area as a proxy for shell density. And a positive change would correspond to an increase in density, and a negative change would denote a loss of shell density. And so I'm only going to be looking at King Slough and Pool Slough. Those are the sites that we have the most recent carbonate chemistry data for. And I've also included temperature as the size of the dot, because temperature affects the saturation state. On the right are just the environmental parameters that were used to average the data points. For example, a growing period from July to August, the difference in shell density is the August shell density minus July, and the saturation state is the average of saturation state in July and August. And at King Slough, you see what could almost be a linear trend in increasing saturation state and this positive change in shell density, which possibly might indicate that the process of shell extension and calcification is tightly coupled to the saturation state, and maybe not so much salinity or these other variables, but that the carbonate chemistry is very dominant on this process. At Pool Slough, you don't really see any pattern. It's kind of all over the place here, which is okay. This is preliminary data. And so we think that there might be other variables controlling this process of shell extension and calcification, that it's not dependent on saturation state and carbonate chemistry. That was not a ton of data for the saturation state. So we are hoping to expand our carbonate chemistry sampling via spatial surveys, and also to outplant another 500 oysters this year, which would be really exciting to compare last season, when we had a really short upwelling window, to this season, where we hopefully will have a much longer period. Wrapping that all up, a lot of this preliminary work suggests varying environmental controls on Olympia oyster growth throughout the estuary, so different controls at different sites. And by continuing our monitoring and expanding spatial surveys, we could potentially better understand these dynamics. And I would just like to thank all of the funding and support from Oregon Ocean Science Trust and Sea Grant. A lot of the work that we've done in Yaquina has been funded by these two organizations in the past, and also everyone that has supported us in the field and in the lab. It's been a really, really big group effort, but it's been a lot of fun, so thank you.
Okay, one question.
Those are just extra slides.
Pressure. Steve, I know you want to ask a question. I'm just going to come up here.
Thanks, Marlena. I really appreciate all the good work here. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, in collaboration with OSU, placed 3 million juveniles, spat, at Coquille Point a couple years back. We've been following that and have seen new recruits on our oysters out there. My question to you is, have you seen evidence of recruitment on your deployed oysters as well?
Yes, that is an issue that we are going to have to address. Last week, I was at Hatfield looking at the oysters, and I noticed a lot of recruits, and that is kind of the issue where if I let them settle, then that I'm going to be measuring their growth as well as the individual I have. So that is something that we're going to have to decide how to handle the recruits, because it's a great thing to see. And I have been able to let some of them grow enough where I can check them off and just put them down, which is unfortunate, but it is, yeah, we've seen a ton of recruitment and that's exciting to see. I'm hoping to find a way to maybe save them.
All right, thanks to Marlena for saving baby oysters. And next, Dr. Chris Langdon needs no introduction. A longtime member of the Hatfield community and researcher on bivalves generally, and he is going to talk to us more about ocean acidification and hypoxia effects on Pacific oyster larvae.
Oh, exercise. There we go.
Great, thank you.
Perfect.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. So I've been around a long time, not as long as oysters, but at least 37 years now here at the Hatfield Center. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing recently. I'm very thankful for some of the speakers who preceded me because they've already set the scene, as you might say. Whoops. Oh, here we are. Yes, going the other way. So as you probably realized, growing oysters is not an easy matter because you're growing them in the natural environment, at least from the spat to the harvest stage. And you're dealing not only with diseases, but also aquatic pests. And there's also a lot of problems, as you've recently heard, about ocean acidification and hypoxia. And so it's a very complicated environment that the farmer has to work in. And as you have heard now, the life stage of the life cycle of the oyster is actually quite complex. There's a process of egg development where the animal is very susceptible to ocean acidification effects as they form this shell. And then the later stages of the larvae are not so sensitive. They go through metamorphosis and then become spat and adults. And these stages are even less sensitive than the early development of the larvae. And this is some slides, some pictures of some deformed larvae from the Whiskey Creek hatchery. And you can see these are normal larvae here. These are larvae that have been developed in acidified seawater. You can see that the shell is smaller and highly deformed. This is a slide that Burke just showed earlier on, and it's a slide where piece of work where we described and determined that this deformity of the shell in the developing larvae is really related to aragonite saturation state, and there's a critical level at which this deformity starts to occur, about 1.5, 1.6 in terms of aragonite saturation state. Aragonite saturation state is just a measure of how soluble the shell of the larvae, which is mainly made up of aragonite, is in seawater. So it's a shell dissolution. It also affects the rate of formation of the shell. Now, all the work that we've done previously in the lab looking at effects of ocean acidification on larval development have been carried out in static systems. In other words, you have a closed beaker of seawater, you put the larvae in, and you try and do your best to control changes in OA conditions by adding antibiotic microbes and things like that. But nonetheless, you get quite bigger fluctuations. Here's some work that Evan Derlin did in 2016 in the static systems, and you can see over a period, I think this was over a period of the experiment, which was about 12 days, there were big fluctuations of 0.4, 0.2 aragonite saturation state units. Oh, sorry, these are pH units. And that may not sound very much, but it actually has a major impact in aragonite saturation state. And so what we've been trying to do as part of this project that we're working on currently through funding from Oregon Trust is looking at the way of improving that test system. It's not going to be as sophisticated as the Burke-lator, but hopefully it'll give us some more precise control over how the acidification conditions are administered in these experiments. And so what we've been doing is developing what we call the Huddle system, a Hatfield ultra-density larval system. And here it is in its entirety. There's some header tanks here which feed seawater by gravity and pumps. Here are some pumps here through these tubes that are modified McDonald trout hatching jars. And you can feed algae through these pumps also into these jars. So here's a picture of the larvae here and the schematic of the system. Basically, seawater and algae flow in one side, pass through the screen, and then out the other side. And this, what we call the saber sieve, has a mesh that prevents the larvae from being washed out of that chamber. And here it is in action. And what we do is we aerate this tube, and the bubbles pass over the surface of the screen to keep the larvae from sticking onto that screen. And we've done a lot of experiments to optimize this, because obviously we want to have a system where the larvae do really well. And here we find, here's some experiment results here where we look at total spat produced per rearing container. This is the Huddle system. This is the traditional static system. So you can see that it produces a lot of spat in quite a small volume of seawater. This is the equivalent volume of the chamber. And the next step, which we're just working on now, is to control the OA conditions in these chambers. We've adopted a two-stage approach where we do coarse adjustment of pH by bubbling with CO2 enriched air and using a pH probe to roughly control that pH and acidified conditions. And then this water from the header tank goes then into the Huddle's chambers. But as Burke has mentioned, and others have mentioned too, the pH probes are not very accurate. And so we've adopted a second stage here where we fine control the pH by using mass flow controllers. These are produced by a company called Alicat, where they mix proportions of air and CO2 in very accurate and precise ways. And this will allow us to control the OA conditions in the tubes to a much greater and more precise way than the standard method of using pH probes to control the OA. And then once we've got the OA Huddle system worked out, which we hopefully will do this year, next stage is to use this Huddle system to try and look at how oyster families and oyster individuals differ in their resistance to OA, and perhaps start developing a more resistant oyster in a breeding program. And so this is the first step, which we've already achieved, where we've mixed families from about 75 families from what we call a cohort. This is some work we do with a mask and broodstock program, which is a breeding program that I work with. And we've exposed this mixed population either to not higher acidified conditions in the hatchery, or we've had a control where we expose them to ambient conditions. And then each of these two groups in the hatchery, we've exposed to two different field conditions. One high up in the Uquina Oregon oyster, where we had some very high summer temperatures, and then in a less temperature extreme conditions in Willapa Bay. So we're testing performance of the larvae in the hatchery under OA stress, and also in the field under temperature stress. And what's called summer mortality in oysters is a real problem for the oyster growers, where a lot of them die as a result of temperature stress. And these are the results of this first test with the parental population. We mixed the families together, and then we genotyped the fastest growing or the biggest oysters from those that mixed family population. And we compared the distribution of those individuals amongst families in the stressed versus the non-stressed population. And we were able to identify families, for example, this one that did very well in the hatchery under OA stress, as well as in the farm under temperature stress. So this is a robust, what we call a robust family that we want to use to produce the next generation. This family, on the other hand, didn't do very well in either of those two conditions. And so this family, we don't really want to use for future breeding. And this is the second stage, which we're going to be working on this year, where we take the parents that have been stressed and that do well under stress conditions, create a population, run them through the hatchery under OA stress conditions, as well as planting them out in the summer under high summer temperatures, and then do the same for the same families, parents from the same families that hadn't been stressed. And then hopefully we'll be able to compare the results in these hatchery and farm, and hopefully the offspring of the stressed parents who have been shown to be tolerant of those stresses will do better than the offspring from these non-stressed parents. And we should be able to calculate heritabilities. And once we calculate heritabilities, then we can be confident that we can improve a stress tolerance to both temperature and OA conditions. So I didn't put my name here. I wanted to acknowledge Henry Fleener, who was responsible really for developing the huddles. And those of you who are interested, please contact him. He now works for NOAA up in Alaska. So thank you very much.
We do have time for a question. Anyone? I think those huddles are really cool. As a previous culturer of shellfish larvae, those are awesome.
This question is regarding how, in terms of your selection of best performers, are you going to go into any kind of genetic interrogation of any of that?
Sorry, genetic?
Genetic interrogation of what you
yes.
find.
So we do have a parallel source of funding from another grant, as well as a lot of a big program that's run by ARS, USDA ARS, that's on breeding oysters, particularly resistant to herpes virus. But there's potential there to do some more gene sequencing of the better performing individuals, and also perhaps look at some RNA-seq, some responses to these stresses and see how they differ among the different populations, two different populations. But it's expensive, as you know.
With no more burning questions, thank you so much, Dr. Langdon. And now I'm gonna offer a little interlude. I just want to shout out to members of the West Coast Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Science Panel, which convened in the mid-teens of the 2000s and really left some recommendations for the West Coast that have been very formative, including shaping a lot of what's here today. George Waldbusser, Burke Hales, Francis Chan, Jack Barth, and Waldo Wakefield represented Oregon on that panel, along with BC, Washington, and California researchers. Just want to shout out the importance of that group as I now switch gears from science-focused work to communicating of science and goals. And this is not a comment on any previous speaker's ability to communicate, but rather seeing that there are always ways of improving messaging and thinking about audiences and receptivity of information and goals and visions. And our last project that we're going to hear about this morning will be presented by Nancy Hotchkiss and Nettie Pletcher, who are going to talk about the Pathways Collaborative work to develop an ocean acidification and hypoxia communications plan. This, along with all of the previous projects you've heard about, are all outlined as high priority in the Oregon OAH Action Plan. Nancy and Nettie, take it away.
Thank you. Yes, I am not Nancy. I'm Nettie. That's Nancy. We have a third partner, Terry O'Connor, who's based in Seattle, who's an advisor to this project as well. And we do want to acknowledge the Oregon Ocean Science Trust for being brave enough and wise enough to add this piece to their grant packaging to get the communication piece in there as well. I affectionately refer to them as Oostlandia. So what you have heard about, will you click for me? Okay. What you've heard about so far is a lot of ocean science. Click away. This piece is social science, and it's an opportunity for for us to build out a coordinated messaging plan that is designed to really inspire some select target audiences to engage around OAH and all the work that you've heard about, but maybe not at that deep of a level. So we have a couple different pieces that we're working on. The first was to prioritize what are those audiences. We can't possibly reach everyone with all of the messages, so we have to be selective. And we'll talk about how we chose some target audiences and key actions that we're working on for them. Then we're going to be creating some specific messages that will inspire those actions and put that into a communications toolkit. And the third piece is really rolling that out through the implementation plan. So the way that we started thinking about audiences is we brought together the OAH Council and the Education and Outreach Working Group and invited their input into what is the whole possibility of audiences. And we brainstormed together and did a couple different exercises. And we ended up narrowing our big list down to 8, using some of the factors that you see here, really thinking about, what's the relative size of that audience in Oregon? How easy would it be to reach them? What's the geographic distribution? So we considered a bunch of different factors and did a little elimination round. And then we came up with little characterizations of each of those 8 audiences. So we described what that audience looked like and asked those groups again, as well as the OPAC folks, thank you for those of you who are part of that, to do some rating on a variety of scales. So the ability for that group to amplify the messages, the number of barriers to connecting with them, the value of increasing their civic readiness, which we'll mention more in a moment. So some of those things we asked them to just rate. And then we also said, okay, so just kind of gut reaction, what are your top 3 choices? So we had that process, and through that, we came up with 4, what ended up being 4 that really rose to the top. The 4 audiences that we're focusing on are local government, but specifically port and county commissioners. And then we have 3 groups that are very related: the seafood suppliers and restaurants that are serving that seafood, the commercial fisheries and harvest industry, and then the tourism group, but we're really focusing now on local non-chain hotels. And you can sort of see the upstream and downstream relationships of those 3 groups there. So we have 4 key audiences, and the purpose that the thing that we're doing with these audiences now is really trying to develop the messages for each of those that resonates for those groups, that will help them communicate further within their networks, within their groups, and making a real difference at the legislative level in whatever channels that they can, because the real goal is to increase civic readiness. What do we mean by that terminology? Nancy is going to take over and tell you what we mean by civic readiness.
So exciting.
So civic readiness, I mean, when you're talking about messaging, you want to go for a specific goal. And the reality is right now, we don't have a very specific piece of legislation or a specific, county regulation that you want to have done. We want to get people into a state of civic readiness, which is to get them kind of all in the mindset that you guys all are. It's like, I want to know about this. I want to do something about it. And we've defined it as possessing the skills. So we need to look at what are the skills that are necessary for that. And we added in fierce desire, because we want to light a fire in them, to respond to calls that may come for action or legislation or funding related to ocean acidification and hypoxia, and in a number of different levels. You can think local, community, state, and regional. Notice we did not say individual actions, because individual actions, social science has told us that that does not get people to a bigger thing. It's the whole concept in conservation of the one and done. Like, I recycled my aluminum can, I've saved the rainforest. I drive a Prius, I stopped climate change. No, you have to go bigger, and you also want to think on a bigger level where it's a community action. Oops, you go. Oh, your turn. Yes, you play. I'm sorry, I ruined it. Yay, that's what I did. Okay, so let's click through all of them. Thank you. So what we've done from this point is we've tried drafting some metrics, because when you're doing messaging, you can't just like toss it out there and say, do with it as you want. We really want to get people to a specific action. So we've drafted some actions for each of these audience groups. We've gone back to the OAH Council, to the education group, to talk about what these are, to test them out with them. We've refined some of these metrics, and right now we are having conversations with people to test them a little bit. And here are some of the ideas. Now, admittedly, these we're only 1 year into this project, right? We have another year to keep going. But things like, say we ask the legislators, following some training that we've given you about OAH, X percentage of the port and county commissioners are stepping up and making official remarks and statements endorsing OAH solutions. Perhaps in the restaurant area, a certain percentage of the restaurants get all of their seafood menu items from certified sustainable seafood suppliers, and they promote that. In commercial fisheries, a metric could be that the commercial fishery fleets are now out there articulating the challenges that they have of OAH to other audiences through public presentations, maybe media appearances, maybe community meetings. And then with the hotels, what about a metric of, a certain percentage of the Oregon hotels participate in regular opportunities to collaborate and share strategies and progress around cutting carbon emissions in their operations. So where are we right now? We have started doing conversations, which had started actually yesterday, with having meetings with various folks in these target audiences to get some more information from them, to talk about challenges, to talk about potential metrics and goals for them. There may be some people in the audience that have already gone through this with us. Thank you. And if we haven't gotten to you yet, we have a sign-up sheet. We can find you. But we want to understand how these folks are working every day and how we can help them. Because ultimately, we're going to be developing a toolkit, a communications toolkit, that will be used to train folks so then they can become messengers. Part B, which we are starting tomorrow over at the aquarium, is, and thank you, aquarium, for letting us talk to your visitors. We're going to try and work on creating what's essentially called an explanatory chain, putting a fairly complex issue into some fairly everyday language. And it's going to be a fun tabletop activity where we ask people, we explain what the ocean acidification and hypoxia is, and then we challenge them to say, you're going to talk to a group of fourth graders. How are you going to do this? And we're giving them some different cards with information on them that they can pull together what they think would be their sentences, 2 or 3 sentences to start it off. By the end of that, we hope we will have enough continuity in the answers to have created a fairly simple kind of elevator speech, which anyone can use to talk about ocean acidification and hypoxia. And then the last part is we're taking the targeted messages and looking at how those things can design civic readiness for each of these audience sectors. It's a challenge. Great. And then we've got lots of work, so much work that we're going to be doing between now and the end of our project, which is May of next year. We will be creating the communications toolkit, and a lot of the information that you all have presented today could become parts of it, because we want to show people there's some really interesting science going along. There's some cutting edge pieces. As Karin said at the very beginning, Oregon is at the cutting edge. And wouldn't it be amazing to mobilize these target audiences to keep Oregon in the forefront? You know, we are making changes. We are doing the legislation. We are funding things at outrageous levels. Okay, that was a dream, but a girl can dream. That we are going to keep Oregon, you know, moving forward, trying to create solutions that then can be, go out to the rest of the world and they can pay you royalties. That might work. So we've got all of this information that we need to get done. Working with folks, I do want to tell you, we do have a sign-up sheet outside. If you are in one of these target audiences, or if you know of folks that are in those target audiences that you would love to have us talk to, please sign up and we will set up Zoom calls with them, because we actually are not Oregonians. I'm sorry. San Diego, Baltimore. And we love it here. But we've got also, and we do have cartoons. What? Just, yeah, don't go so fast. No. Yeah. We want to point out also, it's okay to have humor in, and we did see some, I still think you're in that band that I saw, Percolator. But using humor, it's a way to get to people. Don't be so serious all the time. You can attract people with some humor and then get the good information into them. So I am not going to read this cartoon. You can come up and read it if you would like. We're excited and we're really appreciative of the opportunity to work with, you know, Oregon, which is moving ahead, the OAH Council, the Education and Outreach Group, and we are grateful to the funders for this project. And we will take any questions now.
We've got a question, and I'm mobilizing. Oh.
Hello. I believe I am probably in the minority here because it seems to be talking about bay clams and oysters. However, I am very concerned or curious, I guess, is the take on razor clams.
I'm sorry, what?
Razor clams, because it's a very large industry here as well, in Oregon and Washington. And so I wanted to get your take, or I wanted to find out if you were going to include that in on your
any of the harvest fisheries. If you have a representative, someone who is local that you would like us to talk to, we would love to get their perspective on this and how we can help them talk about this more. Yeah, we're the talking about it part.
And I'm going to give Steve Rumrell a moment to talk to Razor.
Only
Thanks so much for raising that issue. We certainly recognize razor clams are totally different. Going on the outer coast beaches. We have called for research on the effects of ocean acidification and hypoxia on razor clams, fully knowing that they're occurring in the surf zone where aerated waters may really modify that. So we don't have much information about ocean acidification in the surf zone itself. That's a particularly vexing problem.
And now Cheryl Brown.
Hi, thank you. This was really interesting. And I'm curious of whether there's been any thought when you're identifying these fierce advocates and this messaging of perhaps conflicting advocacy within a group. And one that I think of, you know, like acidification, the problem is CO2. Needing to go to green energy solutions. Ocean industry, fishing industry is very much impacted by acidification, but the whole thing that happened with wind energy offshore.
Yes,
we're aware of the issue.
Yes, we know about the issue, and one thing about a really good communication plan is we're not going to tell people this is exactly what you have to do. We want to get people fired up to have these conversations within their community, because in reality, a community level solution coming from the community is one that's going to happen, as opposed to, you know, San Diego and Baltimore coming in and telling you, here's how you have to solve it. So yeah, all these things are so complex. It is not an easy solution. You try and find which is the best thing for us right now. Did that answer that? Kind of.
It was much better than my answer, which was going to be, oh, we're out of time.
Stay from wind energy.
Other questions? Yeah.
Don't you step away from me.
Hi, awesome. Great to see this communication approach being applied to this important issue. My question is about the diversity of the target audiences that you have, because they are very diverse groups. And in the spirit of kind of equitable communication, do you have a plan to target diverse groups?
It's an interesting question. I mean, we looked at probably people's professions more. Again, this big, long spreadsheet, I don't know how many audiences we started with. The OAH Council we asked them, who do you want to talk to? And they, gave us a huge list, and then we winnowed that down. So are you talking about, help me understand which diversity you're talking about? Ethnic?
Language spoken, I mean, specifically thinking about restaurants, tourism industry.
God, yeah.
There's a lot of diversity there, and to get this message into as many groups and avenues as we can, I think would be the most beneficial.
Yeah, I agree. And whatever we can do, again, when we're going to try and create messengers, create the tools to create messengers within each of these communities, coming from within that community. So again, some of those needs are going to come up. I agree with you, like the restaurant and the hotel industries, you are having multiple languages, and we would need to translate materials.
Great questions. And I'll just add that in talking about these issues, these messages will not be limited, in who they would be used with. But as a scientist and working with communicators now, it is very clear that you need to have very strategic audience identified, and you can't talk to everybody all at the same time. And so this project is really trying to focus in on a couple of audiences, even though it's really like 4 plus another 3 or 4 more, trying to be strategic. And I will just end that comment with the fact that this is for a plan, not for implementation of the plan, which we do not have the funding to do. And so that is a whole other next step.
But what is really nice to know is if you've trained someone, given them all the information, people wear a lot of different hats. I may be, a hotel person who also is a runner or a surfer or this or that. And you look at all the different spheres of influence that a messenger can have. We needed to pick specific audiences to get started.
We have one more question. Oh, we have one question there and one question here. I promised Tim. So you go first, and then we'll end with Tim.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm boots on the ground as far as this is concerned, not very familiar with the social science aspect. One thing that caught my attention was the 6 Americas scale regarding climate change. Can you describe that? I haven't heard that before. Thank you.
Oh yeah. Yeah, if you want to really do a deep dive into be complete dorky into data, go to the 6 Americas webpage, and they do annual surveys of American attitudes of climate change and all aspects around it. You can dive down by zip code for their data. So we can see, like, one of the things in Oregon, and I can't remember who said it earlier today, about just talking about it is an action. They actually have a question about how often do you talk about climate change? Wouldn't it be great if in a couple of years we see that Oregon, the conversation's happening and it jumps from 10% to 50%? It's a goal.
Is home, Tim Novotny.
Thank you. So this is kind of a grand picture question, and looking at the grand picture, is your overall goal to develop a couple of variations of a general message to have whatever the target audiences are, to relay, get people interested and point them in a direction. And because I know it'll run out at a certain point, you have an end goal. What happens after that? Because messages will change, and in that time, things will change. Will there be ongoing training and support for the civic leaders, or will they be able to continue to craft the message as it goes forward beyond that? Or is it really looking at a general message that will be evergreen after that?
Karen? We're gonna let you answer the long-term part.
I think ideally it's the latter, right? It's building a way of talking about this that will be a plug and play, where you can add in new information and new insights into a framework that helps you talk about it. But it's yet to be determined. And I think those are good thoughts, Tim. And these questions are very helpful. And Nancy and Nettie are integrating everything we're saying into their thinking on this. So thank you for giving them more to think about. And we will stop there. So we are at the closing remarks period of time. And so I wanted to do a quick recap of what we've talked about here. We've talked about monitoring for chemistry and using fishermen collaboration. We've talked about the monitoring station in Yaquina Bay as a new investment. We've talked about resilience in eelgrass habitat and assessments and understanding how they function. We've talked about precision monitoring, how important that is, and actually helping us understand the problem at hand. We've talked about perceptions, about what is good and what is bad in terms of impacts and operating businesses in these systems that are impacted by ocean acidification, both with submerged aquatic vegetation and shellfish. Talked about oysters and how they grow across an estuarine gradient. An estuarine gradient can be used as a proxy for a gradient of climate and ocean change as well, changes that we're seeing coming our way. How to build a better oyster larva and actually dig into what's happening at the real young stages of some of these life cycles. The juveniles are often the ones that are most vulnerable. And last, how to talk about these problems and being intentional about how we're talking about it. Not only that we're clearly talking about the problem and that the problem is understood, but that we are solution-oriented, hope-oriented, and have some humor in what we're doing. Because it's pretty grim. It's a tough future. And I'm going to get choked up. I might pass it to you. Do you want to say anything about? Yeah, I was going to introduce Lee.
Okay. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for listening, participating, and all the great questions that you've asked throughout the talks. Today is a sad day for us as well, because our fearless leader here, the OAH co-chair, Karen, is leaving us for greener pastures, maybe not greener pastures, different pastures. And I'll let her tell you a little bit about what she's going to be doing, and she'll still be interfacing with this community, and very excited about working with her in her new role. And our incoming co-chair, Leaf, do you want to introduce yourself and just say a few words?
So yeah, I'm Leif Rasmussen. I work for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and my role is as the fisheries research scientist. So we figure out ways to kind of support stock assessments and things like that. If council has a problem, they come to us. My background's actually as an oceanographer, though. I built ocean models, like we heard those talks earlier, way back in the day, trying to understand how crab larvae and ocean dynamics affect circulation and population dynamics and things like that. So, and then if you go back even further, I grew up in a fishing family. I grew up in a commercial fishing family. So, you know, I have this direct tie to this. This is something that I grew up with and I experienced. So that's why I'm excited to step in, kind of help out, work with Lori, and hopefully carry the reins. Not nearly as good as Karin, but somewhat close.
So yes, I would like to give a huge round of applause to Karin for. Yes.
The theme of change is personal as well as oceanographic, let's say. And I will be moving on to Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, where I will be working with the state of Oregon, but also the states from Alaska to California on fisheries issues and really conserving and protecting those fisheries, AKA preserving and protecting ocean health and supporting fisheries. And so I'll be bringing a lot of this work into that role in new and exciting ways and still interfacing with all of you. Leif is a great leader, and I look forward to seeing what he does with the council. Lori has been amazing over the last year as co-chair. Jenny is wonderful staff, so reach out to all of them. I do want to highlight that Dr. Jack Barth was the original OSU co-chair with me of the council and contributed greatly to the success of this and to the success of the Ocean Science Trust. We've worked very collaboratively with the leadership there to make this happen. And so kudos to all of them, as well as the Coastal Caucus that I mentioned earlier. So my request to all of you is that you continue the work that you're doing to think about how this impacts your life, your network, your business, your profession, and figure out ways to bring this into what you do and make a change and impact what you do in your life. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure and honor, and have a great day. It's adjourned.